Thank you. Let me just get this whole screen sharing rigmarole taken care of here, and we can get started. There's the button. Are we good?
We are good. Go for
Great.
it.
So thanks for, I'm going to move this out of the way. Okay, great. Thanks for having me here today. I'm Greg Dunlap. As Paula said, I work at Lullabot. We are a full service agency, 100% employee owned, mostly focused on developing large scale websites for Drupal. We've been in business for 20 years, and our clients cover a broad spectrum of verticals, including media, higher ed, and state government. We actually do a lot in the state government and higher ed area these days, as that's a place where Drupal is getting a lot of traction. Um, let's start with a story about 4 years ago. I was at Confab, and a woman named Laura Robertson was on the main stage, and she polled the audience. She said, everybody who's here who loves their CMS, raise their hand. And as you can predict, the entire crowd was silent, except for me. I was the idiot who raised his hand. But I think that the thing about that is, I think a lot of people hate their CMSs, but I think that what most people do not hate isn't really the CMS themselves. It's the custom functionality that doesn't fit the way that they work. They were complaining about opaque business requirements sent down from on a high with no consideration for the people who have to enter content into those systems. They were complaining about being disenfranchised day in and day out from the very system that they're expected to use to do their jobs, that weren't designed with their needs and use cases in mind. And, this is really important because if you're going to spend, often millions of dollars building a CMS for your enterprise, you actually want people to engage with it. If they're filled with dread every time they log in, then they're not going to use it. They are not going to log in unless it's absolutely necessary. And once they do, they'll try to get out as quickly as they can. And that's not how you create quality content in your system, by making something that people don't want to use. You'll have content that gets old, that isn't updated, or that doesn't get entered at all. And you may be asking yourself, yes, that's all very well and good, but I'm just a content designer or a UX designer, and the CMS is the realm of the developers and IT and the marketing executives. So what can I do about this? And that's what this talk is about today. But first, I think we're going to look at a little history first to provide a little background, because I think it's interesting if we think about where CMSs have been and where they've come in order to sort of frame how we look at them. So if we go back into the Stone Ages, when I first started developing websites, you had files. You just had a single file sitting on a computer for every web page that you wanted to display. And if you needed a new page, you made a new file. And the files lived on a server somewhere, and you had to pull them down, edit them by hand, and put them back. And if there was something you wanted on every page, you had to put it in every file. And if it changed, you changed every file. And hopefully you weren't working on this files the same time as somebody else, because at the end of that, someone was going to be unhappy. And that was how I built all of my first websites in the early 90s. And it was exhausting. And during this time, web content was really mostly owned by programmers or system administrators, the people with the specialized knowledge of how these servers worked, because they were the only ones who understood how to make the changes and get them deployed. And if you needed your content to be changed, you had to contact them and they would change it for you, because the tools needed to change that content were complicated and they weren't approachable by anyone else. And oftentimes, honestly, these developers were the only ones who kind of knew the websites exist. And so they just put the content there on them themselves, because the content during that time was very simple and nobody really thought about it. So the thing to remember here is the tools required specialized knowledge, but the content needs were extremely straightforward and limited. Now, In phase two, we kind of like look at the beginnings of content management because as organizations began realizing the strategic importance of the web, marketing and stakeholders wanted more and more control over that content, but they lacked the skills or knowledge to use the tools that were available. So people started to create content management systems to bridge the gap. And the earliest ones were little more than an interface to write HTML into a very simple form. This is actually a screenshot of the first content management system I ever built over 20 years ago. A friend of mine owned an agency that did design, but he didn't have any back-end experience. So I would do freelance gigs for him. And I built this little content management system where you could write, this was for a church in Tennessee, and you could write text into these little text blocks, and then a developer would have to say, I want this text blocks on these pages. And once they did that, then the people who are running the website could just go in there and change the text at will. And you can see it's got a simple little HTML editor that was a very, very new thing at the time. And it worked. It wasn't the most complex thing in the world, but it worked and it got the job done. And it was actually a really big deal because these new tools enabled content people to have access to the websites. Like the sysadmins no longer held the keys to the content. It also allowed a level of reuse that was really important because if you wanted a block of text in the footer of every page, you could set it up once, and now I can change that block of text here and it'll spread throughout the rest of the website, which made things so much easier. It seems ridiculously simple now, but it was a huge step forward. This was the beginning of kind of a switch. The tools were becoming more approachable and less specialized, but because the content needs of organizations were growing and the websites held more important, the content itself was actually becoming less approachable and more specialized. You needed more planning to create content that worked through larger organizations, and the content was more critical to their success, so it required more care. And this leads us to phase three, which is kind of the last 20 years or so. And a couple of critical things happened during this phase. And the first is that content management systems, far from the simple stuff that I hacked together when I was doing the stuff for my friends, have matured enormously to the point where they are, despite the fact that some in this crowd might argue, highly usable without specialized training. And that is really incredible. And content management has become, a multiple billion-dollar industry with, major players like Adobe, having it be like a cornerstone of their company's success. At the same time, the web itself has changed massively in ways that have caused the content itself to become much, much more complicated. Like you can't just write a page of content and call it a day anymore. Mobile devices have changed how we interact with the web in a truly fundamental way. It has become much more of a priority to enable users with assistive devices and other kinds of disabilities, and to increase the accessibility of our sites. SEO and social media have changed the way that people interact with content. It's become more and more critical for organizations, and users on a whole expect a much higher level of quality. And I think this is the pattern that is really important from my perspective to think about, which is that as our tools have become simpler, our needs for our content have become far more complicated. And I think that's one of the reasons why CMSs seem overwhelming. It's not because the CMS is a complicated tool, it's because the content that has to go into the tool is complicated and representing that in the CMS is hard. And that's what I think of as the authoring experience is how do we take this complicated, structured, multi-use content and put it out in a way that the people who are authoring it can deal with it in a way that's sane and easy and doesn't make them tear their hair out. Well, and if the reason that content authoring is complicated is because the needs of content are complicated, then what we really need is people who understand those complicated use cases of content in order to figure out how to create them. And guess what? That's all of you. That's the work that you do every day, supporting and enabling the complex and varied content needs that organizations bring to the table. And if we are going to focus on solving complex content problems in the CMS, then it stands to reason that the answers are going to be different depending on the organizations in question. Different organizations have different needs and different types of content and authors. A couple of examples of organizations that I've worked with in the last few years. Let's think about a tech startup. It's a commercial enterprise running on probably one single marketing site. It probably has a lot of people who have experience in marketing and running marketing campaigns on the web. They probably have a lot of CMS experience because they've done this a lot in their past. And they're relatively knowledgeable about the web, analytics, SEO, those kinds of things. And the content they're producing is going to be largely SEO focused, marketing content, trying to convert leads and turn them into paying customers. Let's contrast that with a state government. A lot of state governments have a platform of sites, aka they may have a single CMS installation that has to support many, many varied use cases. Their authors are mostly subject matter experts. They're not necessarily CMS or web people. They are, tax policy experts and transportation consultants and people who work behind the counter at the DMV. They're people who know a lot about their areas, but not about the web and a CMS in general. And they probably have not a ton of CMS experience other than what they have to do, which is probably not a part of their full-time job. They're not knowledgeable about the web. They have a broad variety of types of information that they have to put out for their constituents. So I think the important thing as far as that goes is that the context that you're working in matters. And we are the people who find that context all the time and bring it out for our web users. But you can't approach the content authoring experience as a monolithic thing where certain things are right and wrong, because there is no best content authoring experience. There's only the best authoring experience for the authors you're currently working with, the organization they're creating content for, and the content that that organization is creating. And context matters a lot. So what can we provide that encourages better content for the use case at hand, given the parameters that we're working with? And those answers aren't the same for every organization or system, and they often require more thought and research than out-of-the-box solutions. But finding the right answer is really critical for everybody involved, because we can't make the web less complicated, and we can't change the organizations that people work at. But what we can do is spend more time understanding the forces at play and taking these users into consideration and working towards improving their lives. So how do we do that? Well, as I said before, thankfully, that's the kind of work that the people in this room are uniquely skilled at. And in fact, the design process for creating a successful authoring experience is very similar to the process by which you build websites themselves when you're focusing on end users. And this makes a lot of sense because content authors are your users as much as the people visiting the website are. We often return to these groups as internal users, the people at an organization, versus external ones. And the design process is very similar. You do research on your users, you prototype solutions, you build them, you test them, and you support them going forward and maintain them. For the purposes of this talk, because there is a lot to unpack here, I'm going to focus a little bit on the research and implementation phases, because I think there's a lot to jump into there. So if we start with research, the benefits of user research are well known, but there's one important goal to keep in mind when you're doing research with content authors, and that's that it gives you an opportunity to really connect with them and get them invested. In a lot of organizations, there's a level of distrust or even antagonism between the content authors and the people who are responsible for maintaining the CMS. And bridging that gap can be really difficult, but sitting down and listening to authors who have probably never even been asked their opinions can be the first step towards bridging that gap. And so when I'm starting a project and outlining to the stakeholders who needs to be at the table, I always make sure they bring the authors and their managers to the process, because those needs really need to be represented. And if you want people to not hate the CMS you're building, they have to be invested. So what we'll usually do first is we will sit down and talk to our authors individually, one-on-one. This provides the most direct feedback possible, allowing you to hear people's day-to-day frustrations, identify functionality that's vital or missing, and establish big picture goals or priority issues to be fixed. If you hear a bunch of people talking about their issues with document management or inconsistent design tools, then you know that's something you need to figure out. And this is actually one of my favorite parts of any project, because you really get to connect with people and figure out what's causing them pain and get them excited about the work that you're doing. So before we do interviews, we generally develop a protocol for the interviews, which is a template that outlines everything an interviewer would need to conduct an interview. The bulk of the protocol is the questions you ask each person you're interviewing, but there's also space for background material and any instructions for the people who are giving the interviews. Um, Providing this background can give added context for the interviewers to help them conduct the interview more easily, or I'd avoid any potential trouble topics. You also need to identify who you want to interview. In a small organization, that's fairly easy, but in a larger enterprise, it can be more of a challenge. Your main goal should be to get a broad range of viewpoints. You want to represent a cross section of your organization's authoring community. So like when we go in to do a big state government project, I want to find the people who are the biggest pros, but also the dabblers who have to edit 5 hours a week as part of their job, but are mostly doing something else. And I want the biggest cheerleaders, and I want the crankiest curmudgeons. I want the biggest departments and the ones with 5 employees that nobody ever thinks about. Because if your system needs to work for these use cases, then you need to understand where they're all coming from. And once I have the protocol set, I make a copy of it for each of the interviews I'm conducting, customize them as necessary. We usually do this in Google Docs or Dropbox Paper. The documents now serve as guides for the interviewer, but also a place where somebody can take notes as the interview goes on. I've got a link to our sample protocol template in the resources at the end of this slide, which I'm sure we can provide the link to when we're done. When you're conducting the interview, I always like to only talk to one person at a time. I like the subjects to feel like they have the opportunity to be honest and frank. A lot of times when we do this, the stakeholders for the project want to sit in, and I always resist that because I want people to be able to be honest. Um, and even though we spend a lot of time creating a protocol, I always like to chase interesting threads and veer off in a different direction. If I hear something interesting, I consider the protocol a guide, but not necessarily a set of rules. I'm always digging and asking why. And we hear this a lot in our work. Like there's a lot, you've heard of the thing with the 5 whys. You always ask why 5 times. But I find it really important, particularly with content authors, because a lot of times they will bring things they need to the table that are fixing problems for which there is a better solution, or they're trying to fix a problem that's different than what they're actually bringing to you. So if somebody says something broad or vague, like, I need more design freedom, I don't take it at face value. I dig into the reasoning behind it. Like, what kind of freedom are you talking about? Like, what is your use case? What is the goal or result that you're trying to get to? And chasing down those specific answers to these broad section questions can help zero in on what problems need fixing and what the solutions look like. So, if an author comes to me and says, I need a color to be able to make text multiple colors, like, what's the actual need to these requests? It might be, I need a better way to highlight a passage of text, or it might be, our school colors are green and gold, and I need to create accents. And both of these are different problems which require different solutions, but adding a color picker for text is probably not the answer for either of them. So often you'll find out that what people are asking for is a much broader problem, and the solution is something completely different than what they need. And I always like to get the people to show me what their problem is if to get a clearer picture of it. This is one of the reasons why I like to conduct interviews at people's desks or workspaces, because a lot of times you'll hear people in interviews saying things like, oh, it's hard to work with images, or uploading documents doesn't work right. And I really want to understand what they're saying when they mean what they mean when they say that. It's much easier if you can actually see them do it. I was recently on a state government project where we had a set of interviewees who were complaining that it took too many clicks to get to the page to add a new piece of content. And I know how many clicks it takes to get to add a new piece of content. And so I was wondering what the deal was. And at some point, they had been trained a really roundabout way to do it. They just didn't know. And I wouldn't have known what they were talking about if I hadn't had them actually sit down and show me what they were doing. And so that can be really useful. And it's something that I always try to make happen if I can. Um, and then as we conduct interviews, we summarize them in a matrix, which outlines key findings. And that's really useful, especially if we're sharing this out to other stakeholders and things like that. We also do workshops a lot, and they're like interviews in that you're getting feedback directly from the users. However, they're different because they're done in a group setting, and they usually involve all of the different types of stakeholders in a project. You'll have the content authors and the technical stakeholders and the marketing people and the executives all together, working together, brainstorming and working through problems. It allows for a different kind of feedback, and it can take advantage of some group dynamics and hopefully consensus building. Um, and it's a great way to get a bunch of people together to really figure out where priorities and goals are and aren't aligned. Because if different user groups have different ideas of what is and isn't important, you want to figure it out now rather than when you're 12 months into a project in the thick of developing features and everybody's fighting about what comes next. Something I often run at the beginning of a project is an implementation of the KJ card sorting technique. It's the post-its and dot voting that most of us have probably done at some point. But I usually revolve it around collecting pain points and issues that internal users want to see addressed, and then figuring out how to prioritize them. I colloquially refer to this as the airing of grievances exercise. And the way it works is that every attendee is given 5 post-its and 3 dot stickers. The, the dot stickers can be colored based on their roles, but they don't have to be. Attendees write down their 5 biggest issues with their current website: design, functionality, authoring, whatever drives them nuts. If they don't have 5, that's fine, but 5 is the most. And you only give them 5 minutes to write them down, because we just want the things that are really at their top of their mind. And then one by one, we go around and give them the opportunity to talk about these issues and how they affect them. I don't usually give a time limit here because I want people to be able to get things off their chest, but you do want to keep things moving, especially if you have a lot of people. And as they read off their notes, I take it from them and put it on a board. Sometimes there'll be duplicates, and sometimes they won't be, but when they are, I try to stack them so we know how many times that happened. And as I'm putting these notes up on the board, generally I'm thinking about the themes that are emerging. Like, are the complaints mostly about user experience, or they're about authoring, or they're about performance or design? I start making connections mentally as they come up to the board, and slowly but surely things start to group together. And once everything's done, we condense the duplicates, and then we start, doing a formal grouping where we put sort of subject matter notes up. Like, here's the one about discovery and findability. Here's all the notes about that. And here's all of the notes about document management. Um, it's may some of these things may not fit necessarily, but it's rare to find something that doesn't fit into a group of one sort or another. And then once we have those groups together, we put them up, and then everybody puts their dot on the groups that they think are the most important. And then we start to take those dots and translate them into goals that we want to achieve on the project. Um, Sometimes this comes up with really clear winners, and that's great. Everyone agrees is on the same page. However, often you'll find some level of alignment combined with some level of conflict. Most organizations will already know this, and it's an opening act to start talking about it. But some will be surprised, especially if this is the first time you force them to put a cross-functional team all in the same room. This realization in and of itself can be a moment of clarity that makes the whole exercise worthwhile and gets them to start moving forward. It won't be easy, but you can't solve a problem that you don't have, that you don't know you have. Whether online or in person, there's one other task that I think is really important as workshop facilitators. And that's that those exercises only work if you can maintain a level of psychological safety, which allows people to feel like they can share freely without a fear of backlash. There's often a power disconnect in these groups with participants at the executive level mingling with the people enter content into the site part-time, and this can make people hold back concerns they want to address, but you won't get what you need out of that atmosphere. Encourage everyone to bring their best to the table and approach all ideas as equally valuable, regardless of who they come from. So that's just a couple of examples of what we can do with research. Obviously, there's many, many more things that can be done there, but these are some things that I often do and find really helpful. So let's get on a little bit more to implementation. Like, what can we actually do in the CMS to help support authors in the broad sense? As I said earlier, there's a lot of stuff that is very specific to the teams that you're working on. And so this stuff is, but what I'm going to talk about here are really broad, general things that can be thought about and brought to the table. And we're going to divide this into two different kind of concepts. And one is about entering content, which is, filling out the forms and typing them in, and supporting the content that's already created or been created or is in the creation process, which is the content administration. So content entry. Content entry is a lot of HTML forms, and HTML forms are one of the oldest features on the web. And you may have been doing this for a while and think that forms are straightforward and the standards around them are well known. And in some ways, you're right. And there's a lot of good books and texts out there about that. But content entry screens have some differences that I think are really important to keep in mind. For instance, many forms on the web are meant to be filled out once or a few times and then forgotten. You're not going to fill out the contact me form on a website a bunch of times. You're going to do it once and go on about your day. You're going to enter your credit card ideally once and then not have to change it until your card expires or you get a new one. In a CMS, a content author may revisit a form hundreds or even thousands of times in the course of their job. Um, and so that really changes the way you have to approach them in a lot of ways. Also, while most web forms are standalone and designed to be as short and simple as possible, many CMS content entry forms, regardless of how much we might try to simplify them, can consist of dozens of interrelated fields that tie together content from throughout the system and run for many pages in order to fill them out. And that's something that is very different because, as I said earlier, the complexity of content in many of these systems makes it so that there's only so much you can do to reduce what people can enter. Not every website is going to be able to be WordPress where you just enter a title and a body field and go on with your lives. That life isn't like that anymore. Finally, while general web forms are meant to work for anyone without any special training, in a CMS, it's often very necessary to provide training, documentation, and other resources to help users along, especially when they're new. So while your content entry forms may seem like a simple implementation of known technology, there's a lot of things that make the content authoring experience unique. And so some of this might feel like old hat, but a lot of the implications can change in this context. Excuse me for a second, my cat wants out. Come on. I know that everybody doesn't want to necessarily listen to her cry for the next 5 minutes. All right. So one of the biggest things is that we want to reduce cognitive load. Cognitive load theory was developed in the late 80s to describe the mental effort needed to learn new things. The theory goes that individuals can only hold so much information in their working memory at once. And if you present more than they can hold, then their working memory becomes overloaded and learning becomes more difficult. Um, the same concept is applied to user experience design to describe the mental effort needed to learn and use a product. The more cognitive load is required, the more difficult a product like a CMS will be to understand and use. As we've said, modern web content is complicated, fields, taxonomy, metadata, all of those things. And so reducing the cognitive load as much as possible is crucial to a well-designed authoring experience. And cognitive load's not a flat scale. Like the less someone is familiar with a concept, the more cognitive load it'll add to their work. So if your authors are generally unfamiliar with web concepts, generally unfamiliar with CMSs, and they've received minimal or cursory training, then you're starting off at a disadvantage. They're going to have a high cognitive load before they even get started. And as a result, you have to work even harder to improve their experience. And this is one of those things where the context of the type of authors that you have comes into play. Also, remember that content authors, as I said, will use your interface hundreds or thousands of times. And so this cognitive load gets magnified accordingly. It's not like somebody has the pain of using a form once and then getting away from it. If it takes 15 clicks to upload an image and you multiply that times the hundreds of times somebody's going to have to fill that in, you're talking about a lot of extra effort. But at the same time, reducing cognitive load doesn't mean that you make your authoring experience so simplified that it undercuts the goals of making content in the first place. As I said earlier, my content management system that was nothing but a body field was very simple, but it is not prepared for modern content needs. And so the key to build a system that's appropriate for your use case and then make it as simple as use as possible. One of the biggest ways you can reduce cognitive load for your authors is consistency. Consistency is one of the single most important things you can do. And consistency surfaces in a lot of places throughout your authoring experience. For instance, where information is placed. When you make decisions about where things are placed on forums, you should make them as consistently as possible across the platform. If your taxonomy choices are generally at the bottom of a form on one content type, they should be there in the same place on others. If a field appears on multiple content types, it should be placed in the same general area relative to other fields. Display settings and metadata should not be placed in the sidebar for one set of content, but directly in the form at the bottom for another. This consistency is one of the biggest factors for reducing cognitive load. You should also strive for consistency in the field kind of widgets and paradigms in your system. For instance, we recently encountered a system that used 3 different technologies for building flexible landing pages. This lack of consistency created a ton of confusion for these content authors who never really understood which one to use when and why. And once they got to one, never really understand how to use one because it was so different than the other ones. Another thing we see is an approach towards, for instance, choosing from a list of items. You should have some kind of rules around when you're using dropdowns versus radio buttons and things like that, because again, that consistency is very helpful. So getting people to be comfortable with those choices and consistent in the way that you use them is really important. And finally, you should be consistent in the terminology that you use. You'll always refer to items on a form using the same words across the whole system. In fact, let's talk a little bit more about words because I think that's a really good place that people in this group can help out. So the words and text that we write in an authoring system are a vital element in providing context and information to authors. And unfortunately, they are often given very short thrift in the process. In her book, Designing UX, Creating Forms That Don't Drive Your Users Crazy, Jessica Enders says that the core of the interaction in a form is the questions asked and the answers given. And that's why the words we use in the form and not how it looks are the most important part of its design. And there are a lot of words on content entry forms. And they can be extremely valuable for helping the user navigate your interface as long as they're thoughtfully crafted. As we've discussed, there's no one size fits all rules about writing for content authors, but knowing your audience and writing for their needs is important. And here are some general principles for the text on content forms. Keep it simple. Follow guidelines for plain language. We're all familiar with this. The less words you use and the clearer they are, the easier your conversation with authors will be. And the more authors you have and the more diverse their jobs and experiences, the more the words that you choose here matter. Writing for a diverse group means maintaining a laser focus on simplicity and clarity. That said, if all of your users are well versed in the jargon of your organization, then you should feel free to use it here if it helps to communicate with them. Normally, you wouldn't suggest this for web projects, but your target audience here is different. Like we will use a lot of three-letter acronyms when communicating with users at a state government because that's what they do all day and that's what they're used to. But the flip side of this is to avoid the terminology of the CMS. For instance, I work a lot in Drupal, and every piece of content is internally referred to as a node. And words like that mean a lot to people who use Drupal all the time, but they do tend to make their way into editorial interfaces, even from people who are being careful, but they mean nothing to authors and serve to confuse them. Eliminate directional language, things like the field above or the field to the right. Relative placement can change over time, and I've seen many cases where that text does not change along with it. Also, different items may be in different places depending on context, like if you're on a mobile device or you're using an assistive device. And actually, in general, all of these suggestions are great for accessibility. And then finally, and I think the most important thing is to focus on the why rather than the what. Saying what something is doesn't help as much as saying why it's important and how it impacts the content that's being created. And again, the less knowledgeable your users are with web concepts, the more this is probably important. Why does this need to be filled in? What will happen if it isn't? What impact will it have on your site's users if it's done well? These are all super important questions to answer, and enter the summary here is not going to help answer them. Another thing that I think about a lot is the ordering of the pieces that you enter onto a form. The words sorry, excuse me. So during the design phase of project, user-facing pages are designed with a hierarchy of content. The most important information goes at the top of the page, then the next important, and so on until you get to the bottom. A lot of thought goes into this hierarchy. So it'd make sense that when authors are entering this content, they should enter it in the same order it appears on the page, because a lot of content authors think visually. And it's amazing how often I see systems that are designed with their fields laid out in what would seem to be completely random order. As I said, when authors are entering content into a system, they're often thinking about how a page will look as much as they're crafting the words. This is especially true for subject matter experts and others who are not experienced editorial experts. So it only makes sense that content entry screens should be laid out in the order that they expect. It's more intuitive, and it allows them to focus on more important tasks than scrolling around trying to find the fields they need. The other aspect to consider, though, in ordering fields is how often a field gets used. So in this example, the featured image is one of the first things that's on the page. But during our research, we realized that this actually using this featured image in this content type was fairly rare. And a lot of the people we were working with didn't have a lot of imagery with which to place there. So we actually made the decision to move it down to the bottom, even though it was at the top of the page, because that meant that users wouldn't have to just scroll past it and skip it all the time. So there's a combination there of figuring out the architecture of your page, but also thinking about what users are going to be doing all the time. We actually create a spreadsheet at Lullabot when we outline our content types in their fields, and we always lay it out so that the fields are described in the order they should appear on the edit form so that the developers have a guide when they're implementing the fields. So these are just like a few examples of important things that should be considered when you're doing content entry forms. And there's like a ton more to talk about. There's error handling and field validation and how do you manage connected content. And we could be here all day on this, but I'm going to instead move on a little bit to content administration. So where content entry describes the actual entering of the content administration describes how we deal with it once it has been entered. What is the workflow that it goes through? How do people find it and manage it? And there's also a lot on this topic, but I think that one of the things that I found is most helpful is editorial dashboards for people, because the content authoring experience starts right after you log into the CMS. And while a common feature of CMS systems is to put a list of recent content on the page with some search options, it's not very helpful for people and their use cases. Something more customized can really give authors a personalized experience that sets the tone for their usage. This is an example of a dashboard that we did for booksellers at the American Booksellers Association. This was a platform where bookstores can manage their online presence and e-commerce. And so in addition to the list of content that I talked about, it also provides links to see new orders, orders in process, orders with payment pending, because those are things they do a lot. It also has, it's not on this screen, but it also has a lot of information to get to documentation for how to use the system and common tasks. These custom landing pages can provide authors with a really good overview of their work in progress, in addition to what other information that they might find useful. And again, what's appropriate in these dashboards is different not only from organization to organization, but even between roles in a specific organization. But here are some common things that you might put in them. Work in progress, what you specifically are currently working on or have recently worked on, as opposed to what is more common, which is a list of all of the content that has been recently worked on. Content for review. A lot of times we will put together workflows in which some people write content and some people review and publish it. And so the list of work in progress may be different for you if you are a reviewer rather than a reader. This is again an example of where one role might have different information in the dashboard than others. Alerts from external systems like Siteimprove or Google Search Console can highlight content with accessibility or other issues, along with URLs and tips to fix them. I saw this recently in a state government website where they had the button on the bottom that says, was this content useful? And then they would have an aggregation for every user on the system of the content that they owned that had the worst ratio so that they could go look at it and try and figure it out. And then again, easy links to documentation and support. Just as in the content entry system, there's a ton more that we could cover here. Search, how do you choose content types? And even in just dashboards, we've barely scratched the surface. So I want to take a second as we move out of implementation and think about what we have just seen. Consistency of design, the crafting of words, the information architecture of a form or an editorial dashboard. Like this is work that content strategists and UX researchers and visual designers do every day. There's like so much that people in our roles can bring to this process and help to improve content authoring experiences. And I don't think it even really occurs to a lot of us that this is something that we could actually do. But I think the bigger question, in which most people are probably asking themselves now, is how? How do I get involved in this? And this is always the hard part, right? How do we convince our organizations of the value that we can bring to these systems and their design and development? How do we get the off-maligned seat at the table? I was going to do a thing here about breaking down silos and showing your value and all of that, but we've all heard that before. And so instead, I'm going to tell a story. So, in a past life, I was a software engineer, and my first ever Drupal project was 17 years ago in Seattle. I was a software engineer for the Seattle Times, and I was tasked with taking a ragtag collection of bespoke CMSs and pulling them all together into one Drupal installation. And at that gig, I became really close with the content and design folks because they were all super rad people into cool music and movies and culture. And over time, we became like a crew, like a real crew. And that's all of us in this photo on my last day at work before I moved overseas to Sweden. And left to right, that's Neil Schindler, Monica Potter, Jeff Carter, myself, and Sherry Quart. And there were a couple of other folks not pictured, our designer, Sean Carberry, our product manager, Gary Love. But, they're the kind of crew that I still hang with 15 years later when we happen to be in the same place. Like we make the effort to seek each other out. And after our CMS launched, they could come to me with complaints and they knew I'd listen to them and take them seriously. And when new stuff was coming through the pipeline, I would pull them in to make sure it worked for them. Functionally, what had happened that I didn't even really think about at the time was that we had broken down a bunch of silos and created a cross-functional team before I even had words for any of those things. We're all in different departments under different branches of the org chart. But when we connected as human beings, all of that fell away. And when we talk about how content strategists and designers can help on these projects that they're disenfranchised from, and when we talk about breaking down silos, that's what I think of. At Confab last year, Eileen Webb gave a deeply affecting talk called Building Relationships is Content Strategy's Most Valuable Deliverable. And the thesis of that project, of that talk, was authentic relationships are at the core of every successful project. And I truly believe that. And she had a quote which has really stuck with me since then. And it is that it is an act of revolution to make the decision to center people in your process. She points out that capitalism wants to see us as replaceable cogs in a machine churning out product for consumption, but that is not a way to success. Because if you don't know people, how can you advocate for them successfully? One of the things that she suggests doing that she had done in the past is setting up 20-minute coffee meets with basically anyone she could find, anyone in the employee list, almost randomly. And what she found over time was that not only would she find connections with the people herself, but often she would find connections between people who hadn't even met before and didn't even know they were exist. And now you can connect those people with each other too. And that is really breaking down silos. And I know work is work and developers are mean and many organizations will fight tooth and nail to prevent human connection, and lots of people feel the need to protect themselves in that context because yes, some people really are total assholes and I get all of that. But when we talk about breaking down silos and finding the way to work together, this is like what I think of and what I think is really the best suggestion to get yourself into the process. And that's find your comrades, connect with people cross-functionally as human beings. And in the beginning of this talk, I talked about finding the authors and talking to them and getting to know them and getting them invested in the work. And that's the same thing. Like, think about them as human beings, treat them as worthy individuals, and they will bring success to you. And that goes with all the other roles in your org as well. And while you might not find your crew the way that I did, human connection is truly the thing that brings people together. Um, if this has been interesting to you, I am currently, as mentioned at the beginning, writing a book called Designing Content Authoring Experiences. What happened was I wrote this book for a publisher that has now, in the middle of my process, stopped publishing new titles. And so what I did was I made a crowdfunding campaign so that I could finish this book. It has a 35,000 word draft that I'm done with. And what I'm fundraising for is to hire people to edit and design and lay out this book and to help me get it over the finish line and then to actually publish the thing and bring it to market. If you are interested in supporting this, you can use that QR code or the link at the bottom. As of right now, I am Wow, $230 away from making my goal of $12,000 to publish designing content authoring experiences. And this campaign closes tomorrow at noon. So I would love your support if you are into this and feel that it will help make your life and the lives of other better. And now I am open for questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So much good stuff here. And I think we can probably thank some of the people in this event for helping get to that 230 left
Many,
or whatever.
many.
We've been promoting it in the chat all night, and
The
it's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been
the
cool to watch it go up.
And
Thank you, everybody.
we've been hitting
the
refresh too. So
the editor of my book is also the person who will be editing my my book is also in the meeting chat today. So
good,
thanks,
good.
thanks,
That's
thanks to
great.
her. I won't name her. She would be mortified.
All right. Well, we do have some questions for you. Ariel, do you want to cue those up for?
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. The first one is from Laureen, and she kindly says, "There's no way for me to put this politely, so I won't even try." What if people ask for stupid stuff for the website? Things the end user will hate and have trouble using. I want to just say no, but that sometimes won't fly. So I guess that's a governance question or something like
Yeah,
that.
I think there are two parts of that. And it depends on what you're asking for because sometimes authors ask for stupid things, right? And I think that one of the things again that I try and figure out is like what do they really want, right? What are they really trying to do and accomplish, and is there a better way? And it can be hard because one of the things that is difficult, especially with content authors, like I'm in a project right now where we're migrating a bunch of 10-year-old Drupal sites into a more modern platform. And the sites 10 years ago were designed much differently than we would design sites now. And there was a lot of dump everything into a body field and place images wherever you want and that sort of thing, which doesn't really fly anymore. And a lot of the things that I get that are kind of silly from content authors, I won't say dumb because a lot of times they just don't know, they're trying to make things easier on themselves and what they're used to is easier. And I understand and empathize with that. Is just them wanting that, then wanting something that's very, very simple. And unfortunately, making something that's very, very simple doesn't jive. I have another version of this talk where I have a long speech at the end about how if you want success in your CMS, what you need to do is hire people who know about the web to run it. And that doesn't mean that they have to be the ones writing the content, but they should be the ones creating and publishing the content because there's no reason for subject matter experts to know about metadata and a lot of this other stuff. And so I often think that a lot of times when I get those requests, it's more of a hiring and staffing problem than anything, but they do happen. And I think the only thing we can do is work through those issues and get to the source of what people are asking for real and try and resolve those problems.
I love that answer. Yeah, there's so much to be said for translating, right? Looking
Yes.
at what's behind the stupid ask. Very, very well said, Greg. Thank you. Cynthia asks, yeah, you mentioned you were talking a little bit about consistency being key to web experiences and to these content experiences. She says she's seen so many forms where there's a lot of microcopy and help text for only a few form fields. Any best practices for, like how much microcopy do we include? Is there like a rubric for that?
Um, I think I would want to know what is specifically asking about in terms of microcopy. I guess if that's like help text or something like that, I would probably need a little more clarity on that. If you're talking about help text,
Yeah, it sounds like that's kind of what
yeah,
what the what the basic gist is.
Yeah,
yeah,
I was just asking about the fact that like when there's a form, sometimes there will be a little box that says, oh, this is supposed to be digital, numeric or something,
Mhm.
but it's only on one field. And
Right.
I just wonder if you know, you consistencies would mean you would have a lot more of it, but then it would be overwhelming. So I just wondered I guess what determines it, or maybe that's a whole separate conversation. Maybe this is for like a support conversation or something.
I mean, I can say that, like, I often see this as well. Like, some fields will have help and some people won't, and some fields won't. And my experience is that it's not an intentional decision to do on some or not on the others. What happens is that somebody going through the building process dumps a bunch of text into the ones that are easy, forgets about the ones that aren't easy, and never gets back to them. Or alternately, at the last minute or under a time deadline, two fields get added and nobody has time to deal with it. It's not that people are choosing to do something. It's more of a symptom of the realities of web projects and a poor level of planning to put stuff together. So I think that, all of the fields should have help text. All of the fields should explain why that field is important and what kind of content should go into it. And it should do so in as simple a way as possible and in the language of the users.
Yeah, totally. That actually is a really nice segue into the next question, because it talks a little bit about special needs. So the question is from Michael Foley. What special needs do state government types of authors require? Is there something about government organizations that's special or unique?
I think that the thing that we encounter the most in state government, and it's the same in higher ed, is that um, we encounter a lot of different use cases. So for instance, if you are a revenue department and um, you are revenue generating for the state, and you have hundreds of employees, many of whom are responsible for communicating tax guidelines and collecting money. um, you are going to have a different level of resourcing than a department of 10 people with one part-time content manager has. And translating needs across both of those use cases can be difficult. And the other thing that I see a lot in state government is that the people who are doing the content entry are just people who don't do content entry as their full job. They often have other things that they're doing. They got drawn into this as a result of whatever. But it's rare that I see people, except at the largest agencies, who are doing content entry and content management full time. They're always juggling other responsibilities, and they don't have a lot of knowledge about it themselves. And that's one of the things we have to design for sometimes. Like, there are tools that we created specifically for authors who we knew weren't going to have a deep understanding of what we were asking. We spend more time trying to explain to them. We do more trainings about things like how to effectively use taxonomy, how to think of your site as a whole, holistically, rather than just page by page. Um, the usage of PDFs is obviously a huge issue in government, and how to use them accessibly how to use them accessibly, or just move to web content for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, those are the kinds of things that we see in state government most often.
Yeah, I worked on some state government sites, and that rings true for my experience as well. Let's see. David Hillis asks, do you think of a CMS as a content creation tool or a content production tool, or maybe both? And how does this change the UX strategy? Follow-up question to that about and the great AI question. How does AI impact the authoring experience?
I I think the difference, I love this concept of content creation versus content production, and it's something that we've actually talked about a lot internally. It depends a little bit on the system that you're using, but my general feeling is that people should create content in tools that they are familiar with and can use the best effectively. And that's especially true for content that has to be created collaboratively or that has special workflow or review needs. For instance, at a lot of our state government clients, they have, content that has to be reviewed by legal teams, right? And those legal teams are often not users of the CMS. And so for them, and they often don't want to put some of this stuff online anywhere before it's created. So for them, trading around a Word doc with track changes on is their best content creation tool. And I don't fault them for that. Like when they come to us and say, "Oh, can we do all of this in the CMS?" I'm like, "Why would you? You've got a tool that works for you, and it me and you know, everybody's used to it. Going to a CMS to do this is going to be a huge pain. Nobody's going to like it. So just get your content done however you want to, and then use the CMS as a production tool." On the other hand, there is also a lot of work going in these days to build collaborative editing tools into the CMS and into editors in the CMS. And I find that interesting. I'm just like skeptical that it will ever get to the point of like, I would really rather use that than Google Docs. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think of it as a production tool more than a creation tool personally.
Yeah.
Oh, and then as far as how that impacts UX, I mean, it makes things simpler in the CMS because we don't have to worry about a lot of specialized tools. Like one of the things that can get most complicated is workflow. And if you're doing all of your workflow and reviews and stuff like that outside the CMS, then in the CMS, it's a lot easier to deal with, and you don't have to have as many people in the CMS and all of that. So I think it just makes things a little easier. And I love that.
Easy button. I love it. Um, we have another question from Jane Scaglieri. They say, I've read that WordPress has security issues. We are moving to something else. Do you have a recommendation? She also mentions that her org doesn't have the resources to create a CMS from the ground up. So there's that constraint.
My only recommendation to anybody who wants to do a new CMS is to not create one from the ground up. There's absolutely no reason to create custom CMSs in this day and age. But as far as what I would recommend, it's difficult because as there's no authoring experience that's best for every organization in their content, there's also no CMS that's best for every organization in their content. And I've worked primarily in Drupal for the last 17 years, but there have been plenty of clients who have come to us and we've said, "Look, Drupal's not the product for you. You should go do something else," because we don't want to build them something that's not going to work for them. And so I would say that if there's a guy, Dean Barker, he's a very, very, very smart guy in the CMS world, and him and one of his colleagues, Corey Vilhauer, wrote a book called The Web Project Guide, and it contains a lot of information about how to create technology and how to create and how to do a web project that's successful. And I think that is a really excellent resource for trying to figure out what for trying to figure out what CMS is important to you, figure out your goals and priorities. There's also another book that Dean wrote that was called something like 25 Things You Need to Know to choose technology projects. Um, and I'm trying to remember, he was just releasing all of the chapters free on LinkedIn. That might not be the exact title, but if you look him up as an author on Amazon, you'll find it. He self-published that book on Amazon. And so that's also one that's very specifically about choosing technology and how to do it in a way that's best for your organization. And Dean, there's nobody smarter about this stuff than he is.
Nice. We have had the privilege of having Dean and Corey both speak at Content Strategy Seattle. And yeah, agreed. Both really brilliant minds,
Yeah.
great speakers, full of information. I have read the Web Project Guide. It is Bible. It's amazing. So I did put a link to their site in the chat. So if anybody wants to check that out. Yeah, we love resources. Absolutely. We actually have a couple of pages full of resources on our contentstrategyseattle.org website. And we're also always looking for folks to contribute to that. So if you go to that section of the website, which I'll link in just a second here, there's a form where you can actually post articles and things like that that you found helpful in given topic areas. So if you go to the topics section, you'll see those resources in there. Wanted to ask, does anybody else have any questions? Is anything else on your minds? Any conversation pieces you'd like to
We
give
do
to
have
Craig?
we do have one other question from
Oh, we
Jennifer
do.
Wiley. Yeah. Asking how
I
do
did.
developers
Yeah.
respond to your insights and recommendations, Greg?
Yeah.
Very good question.
I was just pointing out in the chat that I pasted a link to my slides, and there's a slide at the end with resources that has links to some of the stuff that I had in my presentation as well. As far as dealing with developers, I come at a distinct advantage because I was a developer. And so I often am very successful in bridging that gap because I can speak their language and I understand their motivations. Also, I'll say that within Lullabot, we are extremely cross-functional and collaborative. And so we very much work together on projects from the very beginning. Like we don't start a project without a strategist, a designer, a front end and back end developer involved from the start. And we are all, very well versed in what we bring to the table and who needs to know what at different times. So that's very helpful. But in general, I think it very much depends on the group you're working with, just like a lot of other things, right? And that's where forging the connections, like I talked about at the end of this, really, really helps because if you can forge connections with people, with your developers, if you can find common ground with them, either within or without work, that really, it just greases the wheels so much. And that's, the reason why I think that finding those ways is so important. And, I think it sucks because we find that I often find that it's sort of like put on us as content people or design people to break those barriers down. And that's really because we are the ones who understand how important it is to do, right? And that sucks and it doesn't, and that work shouldn't have to fall on us. And if you don't want to do it, then I don't blame you. But it is to me a huge part of the path to success.
I would agree. I also think to some degree it's in part because we're user-centered professionals. We fundamentally have empathy
Yep,
for
that's right.
folks. So I think we definitely will like jump in sometimes where other people might not because we have that care focus. So which is a good thing. And it can also bite us in the foot. So one more extremely important question, which I'd like to pose to you, Greg. What is your cat's name?
I have two and a dog as well. So the one that was crying to be let out is named Baby Blue, after the Bob Dylan song "It's All Over Now." Baby Blue. She's a long-haired blue and gray cat. But we usually call her Baby Lion because she looks like she has a big mane on her face.
Yeah.
And then there is also this little beast here, whose name is Farron. If you've ever seen, if you've ever read Peanuts, there's a character, I forget her name, but she carries around a cat and it bends right in the middle and she carries it around on her arm. And its name is Farron, and that's what this cat is named after. But it's also, we mostly call her Tiny for Life or Tiny Baby or Tiniest. She has many nicknames. And then we have a Yorkshire Terrier named Guinevere.
Nice. Yeah, my cat's name is Cora, but I call her Oodle Noodle Doodle. And then how about the dog?
The dog is a Yorkshire Terrier and her name is Guinevere.
Oh, Guinevere.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah,
Well, what
I
a
think that's them all.
nice note to end on. And I just checked the Kickstarter, 175 to go.
Oh my
So
God.
I think you're gonna make it, Greg. It's
I
very
was telling
exciting.
somebody earlier that the anxiety of, that nobody cares about my project and I've been wasting my time all of these years was going to be
Mm.
replaced by the anxiety of, oh my God, I actually have to finish this book.
Been there.
There you
Yeah.
go. They have to happen.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Greg. This was awesome. Thank you, everyone, for your great comments and questions. As we've said before, keep an eye on all of our channels. Jim, would you maybe drop those links in again? That's keep an eye there for upcoming events. I actually just realized I entirely skipped over the slide with our next several months events. So we'll get those announcements out soon. But we do these events every month. And so again, if you or anyone you know would be a good speaker for us, please let us know and keep an eye on our site and our Slack channel and our LinkedIn group for the announcements of our upcoming events.
Thank
And
you all
Greg,
so much for the great questions too. That
yeah.
always, it's so good. Good to hear people's thoughts and ideas and bring those to the table. So we appreciate it.
Much. All right.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. It's been really great. And for all the great questions and support, I really appreciate it.
And we'll look forward to welcoming you back to the Seattle area soon.
Yep.
All right.
That's posted.
Good night, everyone.
All right.
Thank
Have a
Thanks.
good
you.
night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.